In the last video, we visited 118 Banbury Road, which was where Paul Jacobsthal lived. In this video, we'll go a few minutes down the road to 78 Banbury Road, Oxford, and also go back in time about 50 years before Paul to 1885. This was a time and place where the Oxford English Dictionary was written. It's amazing that the English language fits into a dictionary at all, because we have words from so many different spots. It's a hodgepodge of words. There's words from the Celts, who were the original indigenous people of Britain. Words like cross and curse come from them. We've got words like street and wine and kettle, which came from the Romans. The Viking raids in around 800 left us with words like reindeer and ransack. We've got words from the French, which came when the Normans invaded in 1066. The Renaissance increased trade and travel across Europe, bringing words from Italy and Persia to English. And then the British Empire in the 1700s and 1800s expanded all over the world, the Americas, Africa, and the East. And we have words like cheetah and bungalow from India. And English grew and developed so organically that the idea that we could or even would want to document it didn't even come up into the late 1600s and mid 1700s. Samuel Johnson's early English dictionary was in 1755. There is a scene in the English comedy series Blackadder where Blackadder meets Samuel Johnson and he says, "I offer the doctor my most enthusiastic contrafibularities." And Dr. Johnson says, "What?" And Blackadder says, "Contrafibularities, sir? It's a common word down our way," at which point Dr. Johnson pulls out a pen and paper and writes it down for his dictionary, which is a funny idea. But if we were to be really precise about it, there was an important difference between what Johnson was doing in his initial dictionary and what the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary were doing. And that is that Samuel Johnson started out wanting not to document the English language as it was spoken, but to define how it should be spoken. So in reality, he wouldn't have cared much for Blackadder's words. He would have used Blackadder's use of that fictitious word as motivation to rein in the loose way that English was being used. And if that sounds odd, it's exactly what the French do. For example, the French language only changes when the Académie Française says it changes. After Samuel Johnson, there was Noah Webster. He was American. He finished his dictionary in 1825, but a little known fact, he finished his American dictionary while living in England. He was in Cambridge at the time. But it wasn't until 1860 that the work of a new complete English dictionary kicked off. In 1860, it had no connection to Oxford yet. It was the pet project of a group called the Philological Society. It was many years later, when it was clear that a publisher and an investor was needed, that the University of Oxford adopted the project. A little bit of history on the Oxford English Dictionary. The first editor was Herbert Coleridge, the grandson of the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He recruited some colleagues to read books and send in quotations showing how words were used. He built a large wooden bookcase with many slots for these quotations to be stored in. But he died early in the project and was replaced by the second editor, Frederick James Furnivall. Frederick was an older man with a big white beard who loved sailing, and he loved recruiting young waitresses from a local tea shop to sail with him on the Thames. He left his wife for his 21-year-old secretary. He was just, in many ways, too unorganized and too distracted to be an effective editor for such a project like this. But he was a man of precision with the use of words, and he was friends with the author Kenneth Grahame, and he encouraged Kenneth to write the book The Wind in the Willows, which I'll come back to in a future video. But Kenneth based the character of Water Rat on Frederick. Water Rat was a proper rat who corrected others' grammar. But it is the third editor, James Murray, that we'll focus on today. He led the dictionary for 35 some years, from 1879 until he died in 1915, and he almost made it to the end. The first complete edition of the Oxford English Dictionary was published in 1928. James Murray was a school teacher in Scotland. He had a love of dialects, and he took a speech course in Edinburgh in the mid-1850s and met a man named Alexander Melville Bell. Now, there's a fascinating letter in the Bodleian Library from Alexander Melville Bell to James Murray, and I'll read the letter. December 3rd, 1866. My dear sir, we shall be glad if you keep Saturday the 29th free to spend the evening with us. I write early simply because your prior engagements will probably be many that season. Melville and Alexander will both be at home during the Christmas week. The former may probably bring a friend with him from school. On this uncertainty depends our ability to offer you a bed. Should I hear that this friend is not coming, I shall drop you a note. Very truly, Alex Melville Bell. Well, in this letter, we have a leader in the field of phonetics, Alex Bell, writing to the man who would become the primary editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. And just as an added bonus, he mentions his two sons, Melville, who died a few years later from tuberculosis, and Alexander, who was 19 at the time of this letter, and who would, of course, go on to invent the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. Well, anyway, James met the prior editor, Frederick James Furnivall, through Alexander Melville Bell, and it was that connection that set him up to become the third editor. James Murray had 11 children. The youngest was named Jowett, and he took photos with an early Kodak box camera called a Brownie. And many of the only surviving photos we have of the Scriptorium, which is where James and his editors worked for all those years on the dictionary, are from Jowett, as well as some photos of James and his family. Jowett's photos are also at the Bodleian Library, and I'll show a few of them here. When James took over the dictionary in 1879, it was a bit unorganized. The approach to recruiting volunteers to write down these quotations that show how words were being used was still in place, but these slips were just not well cared for. All of the slips from the letter H were missing. Others were found in a moldy sack. So James rebuilt the original pigeonhole system, but he built a much, much larger one. And Jowett and his siblings earned money over the years sorting these slips. Well, it took them all a few years to start completing and publishing. They published a volume at a time, starting with the letter A, of course. While he was a few years in, he was about 47 years old at the time of this, the first volume was published. And he moved to 78 Banbury Road in 1885. That's really where the connection to Oxford starts. 78 Banbury Road is a 5-minute walk closer into Oxford from 118 Banbury from the last video. James and his editors set up a temporary iron shed, corrugated iron roof, in the back garden, and that's where they worked. They called it the Scriptorium. James spent a lot of time writing letters. His granddaughter shared a typical day, which was, to give some examples, a letter to the Kew Gardens to get the full name of a plant, a letter to a priest to clarify a religious point, a letter to the Times to confirm that the word punch appeared in a 1620 issue, a letter to Lloyd Tennyson to ask about a word that he used in a poem, and so on. There are so many letters being sent by James and his team that the Royal Mail built a pillar box right outside of his house. And that pillar box is still there today. To keep from offending the neighbors, they had to build the Scriptorium 3 feet into the ground. It made it damp and cold in the winter. They would work with their feet wrapped in newspapers to stay warm. James got pneumonia a few times because of this. In the first volume, in the letter A, there's an interesting quotation. Under the word arrival, The quotation is, "The new arrival is a little daughter," and this was a reference to one of Murray's daughters, Rosfrith, who was born around that time. Murray was surrounded by people like Alexander John Ellis and Isaac Pitman, who wanted English to be more phonetic, in other words, for words to be spelled the way that they sound. So in the first edition, Murray included words like rhyme, spelled R-I-M-E, to encourage that movement, although most of those experiments have been removed in later editions. There were also many assistants who worked on the various volumes and letters. Famously, JRR Tolkien assisted with the letter W, and apparently the word walrus gave him a bit of a tough time. Well, I want to thank Simon Winchester for his book, The Meaning of Everything, the story of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a wonderful read. And I borrowed it from this for today's video, as well as Sarah Ogilvie's book, The Dictionary People, which I also borrowed from and will borrow more from in the next video. This book is a collection of stories from people who submitted quotation slips from all around the world, and without their work, there would be no Oxford English Dictionary. Well, if you want to hear more about the camel who lived up the street at 118 Banbury Road, you can see my last video. In the next one, I'll talk more about the writing of the Oxford English Dictionary. See you then.